Welcome to the Nicole Osei Report. I'm Nicole Osei, and today I'm joined by SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to get your reaction to President Trump's State of the Union speech and kind of break it down even further and what Trump's vision means for the country. So, in his speech, he bragged about essentially killing diversity, equity, and inclusion. He touted his global tariff plans. He talked about reclaiming the Panama Canal and even invited Greenland to join the United States, just to name a few points. This was red meat for MAGA, but it was very dark for everyone else. What is your reaction to that speech, and can that type of strategy work in terms of tone?
Well, I think it was classic Trump. It was what I would have expected him to do. I think it played well to Republicans in the audience, both there physically in the chamber as well as on television. And of course, as is always the case, it's disproportionately the president's own partisans who watch these things. So the audience on television was disproportionately Republican. And the early overnight polls suggested that it was well received. Now, I think it's uneven in terms of how much appeal these items have to a broader constituency. I think the president is strongest when he's talking about illegal immigration, and he's got some real successes to talk about there in terms of decreased migrant flows, more control at the southern border, et cetera. I think he's weakest when he's talking about inflation because some of his policies are, in fact, inflationary. There's just no two ways about it. A significant tariff policy will create upward pressure on prices. And I think that's the biggest flashing red light for him in terms of a warning sign for his standing in public approval. He's definitely on the right side as far as public opinion goes of the men and women's sports issues, the gender identity issues. Those resonate well with the broad slice of the electorate. I think that the foreign policy things about Ukraine, et cetera, that's more of a mixed bag in terms of what Americans think. But I think the biggest issue going forward for Trump will be the contradiction between some of his economic policies and his stated goal of bringing down prices. And that hasn't really come to an acute pass yet, but I think it may well in the coming months.
And so I want to stick to the economics. So the tariffs, he talked them up during his speech and even claimed that the big three automakers were supportive of that move. But the very next day, he granted them a 1 month reprieve for all autos coming in through USMCA. Now, analysts say that those 25% tariffs could raise costs by as much as $12,000 or more per car. So, you kind of touched on that strategy. Could you break that down more in the terms of Canada and Mexico are our allies? What cost could that have on our economy here, and also the way that other countries are going to deal with us moving forward?
Well, the danger for the American economy is that a lot of our inputs for manufacturing come across international borders, particularly from Canada, to a lesser extent from Mexico. We import things like aluminum and steel and other inputs that go into making automobiles. And if those components become more expensive, then the cost of automobiles will go up. There's just a kind of a basic law of economics there. So I think that's the danger, and I think that's why some of the auto manufacturers had asked for a reprieve. In the long run, American auto manufacturers might be supportive of tariffs because tariffs on imported automobiles would allow them to raise prices of their own vehicles and be more profitable. But on the other hand, there's so much cross-border dependence in terms of automobile manufacturing, so many things moving back and forth between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, that tariffs placed on those countries can actually hurt the bottom line of U.S. manufacturers as well.
And I want to go over to the Chips and Science Act, speaking of manufacturing, which was bipartisan, and it paved the way for $65 billion in investments by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to start building manufacturing capability here in the U.S. And I think Texas was allocated some of that. Why would Trump want to reject that? And how could that affect the U.S. long term in terms of those capabilities and bringing that back home?
Well, chips and semiconductors are really a critical part not only of the U.S. economy, but of the U.S. national security posture. And so that's why we saw bipartisan support for the passage of the CHIPS Act. It's why Taiwan is such an important priority of the United States and Taiwan's security, because so many of those components are made in Taiwan. And if China were to seize it, it would be a real national security problem for the United States and a real economic problem for the United States. So I think there's a bipartisan desire to increase domestic manufacturing of chips. And I think that that's a call from President Trump that's likely to encounter some level of opposition, even within his own party, as reluctant as many Republicans are to criticize any of Trump's proposals. That's one that, as you say, benefits Texas and some other states that are heavily Republican. And so we'll see how far any move to repeal that actually goes.
Now, in terms of defense and security, he mentioned building a Golden Dome missile defense shield for the U.S., again, talking about taking back the Panama Canal. And he also talked about trying to negotiate an end to the Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, before the speech, Trump had essentially blamed Zelensky, called him a dictator, and seemed to side with Putin, even pausing military aid. But during the speech, when he brought up the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan and kind of like hinted that that may have had a role in Putin's decision to strike, some analysts have said that that was an indirect way of acknowledging that Russia started the war. Do you think that he's softening his stance, or is this just another statement that could change on a dime tomorrow?
Well, with Trump, there's always a certain amount of unpredictability in terms of what he'll say from day to day. I will say, I think that Trump's critics have overstated the matter a bit when they claim that he has allied himself with Putin. I think that goes too far. I think instead that Trump has sought to position the United States as a neutral broker in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, some people might object to that. They might say we shouldn't be neutral between Russia and Ukraine, that in fact, Russia is the aggressor, and that we should put the weight of our moral authority on the side of the victimized state here, which is Ukraine. But I don't think that we have gone so far as to ally ourselves with Putin. That's overstating the case. That being said, it's clear that Trump's top priority is just ending this conflict, and that to get an end to the conflict in Ukraine, he's willing to put aside any criticism of Russia, put aside any personal criticism of Putin, and just to really, act in a kind of what was once referred to as realist political paradigm, as opposed to trying to bring an international justice, human rights, international law focus to the conflict. And people can like that or dislike that, but that certainly seems to be the direction in which Trump is going.
What do you make of that turn? Because you were saying that turn, the criticism of that he's aligning himself with Putin is a bridge too far. What do you make of the disparity between the two camps of how the U.S. should go moving forward? Because it seems very partisan right now in the way that we view the war.
Yeah, it has. And it's unfortunate that it's partisan, because I think that both Democrats and Republicans have pegged their views of this conflict largely to their views of Donald Trump. And it's views of Donald Trump, positive or negative, that are driving the bus more than thoughtful reflections on what America's international posture and security strategy should be going forward. And I would offer this as a critique of both Democrats and Republicans. I think Republicans are unduly more negative towards Ukraine than they would otherwise be, because they want to defend Donald Trump and his policies. And I think Democrats have been perhaps more fulsome and full-throated and hawkish in their support of Ukraine than they would otherwise be, precisely because they want to draw a contrast between their international approach and that of Donald Trump. I think the real issue involved in the Ukraine-Russia conflict is whether the United States wants to continue to see itself as the leader of the free world, shouldering not the entire burden, but the lion's share of the burden in leading an alliance of free people and free nations against an axis of autocracy. That's the foreign policy vision right now of most Democrats. Or whether instead the United States wants to transition more to an international arena of great power politics, where the militarily and economically powerful nations of the world have their spheres of influence and largely are given by each other freedom to act as they please in their sphere of influence. That's a reversion to the foreign policy arrangements that largely prevailed in the 19th century. That seems to be where Trump is going and where a lot of Republicans are willing to follow him.
And speaking of the defense and the foreign policy, he talked about, and I didn't really hear too many people mentioning this, but I believe he mentioned something about bringing shipbuilding back to the United States to shore up our Navy.
That's both economic policy and defense policy, because he's talking about vessels that are both commercial vessels and military vessels. He seems to want to strengthen the American shipbuilding industry, both as an agent of economic vitalization in the United States, an agent of wealth generation for commercial shipping, but then also to increase our capacity to build military vessels. And I think a lot of foreign policy and security analysts say that a really critical element of the U.S.'s competition with China in the future will be bolstering the U.S. Navy and expanding the size of the U.S. Navy and making sure that the U.S. retains the ability to confront China in a naval conflict in the Pacific. So there's both an economic trade dimension to that as well as a military national security dimension.
What do you make of because I kind of want to get into the theater of it all and what we witnessed. What did you make of Trump's interaction with the Democrats? He hurled some insults at them, talked about how they weren't clapping. They did not, they were all seated, some held protest signs. Congressman Green was booted from the proceedings when he stood up in protest. What did you make of that interaction? And is this something we're going to see more of going forward?
Well, I would say I think the Democrats still have not figured out a good way to counter Trump. They are still struggling to figure out how to position themselves in resistance and how to strategically counter the kind of mass popular appeal that Trump has. They haven't hit on a good solution. I think their actions during the State of the Union didn't serve their cause particularly well. I mean, holding up those little paddles, I don't think made much of an impression on public opinion. Representative Green's actions were today censured by the House in a bipartisan vote. A fair number of Democrats actually joined with Republicans in censuring Green because I think they don't want to set the precedent going forward for those kinds of disruptions of presidential addresses and things like that. I actually thought Alyssa Slotkin's response was pretty well calibrated in terms of its tone. I think that she took an approach that will resonate with a fair number of swing voters, but the refusal to clap for the parents of crime victims or a boy with childhood cancer in the gallery, that's not a good look, and I don't think that played well with a lot of people who were watching.
So, and you mentioned Senator Slotkin, because I do want to get into her rebuttal. She talked a lot about the middle class and how it's the country's life's blood, and called for more policies to be put in place to ensure that grows. And I thought that was interesting because what we saw in the last election, that Democrats have lost ground with the working class. We saw that here. What did you make of what she said, and do you think that's setting a path for Democrats to follow moving forward as they try to figure out how to counter Donald Trump?
I think it is. I think that Democrats are starting to coalesce around a strategy of being laser focused on economic issues and trying to shed their baggage on the cultural issues. We saw just today, I thought it was quite noteworthy that Gavin Newsom, who's one of the most prominent Democrats right now in the country, came out and said he thought it's deeply unfair to have biological men competing in women's sports. That has been a taboo thing for Democrats to say in the past. But in terms of public opinion polls, they're clearly on the wrong side of that issue. And he's trying to address that, to say, look, let's take that kind of stuff off the table. Let's not be on the wrong side of that and give Republicans a club to beat on us. And you'll notice that during her response, Alyssa Slotkin didn't talk about any of the cultural war issues.
No, she didn't. I saw that.
Yeah, she didn't go to any sort of, left wing or quote unquote woke talking points about race or gender or sexuality. She didn't talk about any of that. She was very, very, very much focused on economic concerns. And how effective that will be, I think, will depend on events. In that, if as we move forward, inflation starts to tick up again, the stock market continues to languish, we continue to see negative economic fallout from Trump's tariff policies and perhaps from his, wholesale firing of government employees, then that will give some real support to Democrats' economic critiques. They'll start saying things like, Trump said he was going to bring down prices. Who knew that he meant stock prices? And stuff like that could be an effective line. And that an economic critique of the Trump administration is probably Democrats' best weapon in going into the 2026 elections.
And on that note, one thing in this whole in the past couple of years that we've been dealing with, and we talk about these culture war issues, because that has not worked well for Democrats, and we saw that bear out in the election. However, on the Republican side, they often lean into those culture war issues. So we saw the whole, for example, the situation in Dearborn, the migrants are eating cats and dogs situation.
Springfield, Ohio. That was
Yeah, yeah,
supposedly
I'm
where
sorry,
that was
Springfield,
happening. Yes.
Ohio. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
Springfield, Ohio. But we saw that played well for them. So when it seems as if when the GOP is pumping that message, it works well with the base. It doesn't necessarily play well for Democrats. Why is there that discrepancy in that arena?
Well, the issue that really worked well for Republicans from a culture war standpoint was the transgender issue.
Yes.
That was one that they made a lot of hay on during the campaign. It's one where the polls show that they're clearly, they hold the majority position with regard to that. Mm-hmm. And so they will milk that for all it's worth. And that's why you see Democrats like Newsom, who I referred to before, trying as quickly as possible to shut that issue down. Mm-hmm. In the same way that you saw President Trump embrace in vitro fertilization, right? And embrace funding for that, because he saw that as a culture wars issue that was hurting Republicans, where Republicans were on the wrong side of public opinion. So he moved to try to neutralize that issue. I would say immigration played very well for Republicans, but immigration is all kinds of different issues. What I mean by that is it's not just a culture wars question. It's also an economic issue. It's also a national security foreign policy issue, right? Immigration has a lot of different dimensions to it, one of which is cultural. But clearly the images of chaos at the border and some of the disruptions in major American cities made immigration go beyond a kind of symbolic culture wars question and to something that really touched on a lot of people's lived experience. And I think that's why Republicans got a lot of mileage out of that.
How much do you think race plays a part in that, in terms of tapping into fear of the other? And that's something that I think the GOP does well for their base. They tap into that, the fear of the other. And how much does race play a part in terms of the way people vote? And because of that fear,
well, that's a big question. I mean, race affects people's voting in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
But in terms specifically of the immigration issue, I mean, clearly racial concerns are a part of it for some people, but I hesitate to push that too far. And the reason that I hesitate to push that too far is that, ironically, Trump's biggest gains between 2016 and 2024, during his time in the national political spotlight, have come among racial minority voters. Trump has actually, since 2016, lost support among white voters, but he's doing dramatically better among Latino voters. He's doing appreciably better among Asian American voters, and he's doing somewhat better among African American voters than he was in 2016. So there's something about Trump's appeal, including even Trump's appeal on immigration, that goes beyond just racial animus. Because, if it were anti-Latino sentiment, for example, you wouldn't see the huge surge in support for Trump among Latino communities. So I think there's a real complexity here in terms of what drives people's positions on immigration. I think among a lot of Latinos, particularly those who live in places like the Rio Grande Valley along the border in South Texas, they're concerned just about the chaos that existed in their communities from an uncontrolled border, right? Their communities bear the brunt of absorbing these huge migrant flows. And so I think a lot of the people who live along the border, who are predominantly Latino themselves, said enough. And that's why you saw Trump's support really surge in those communities.
And just to kind of like take that a little bit further before we wrap up, in the wake of we're kind of moving away from the speech, but just kind of in the aftermath of the election, you saw some of those groups and these are people that voted for Trump, once they saw some of the impact that it had on their community, and specifically with the Hispanic voters and seeing the deportations, some of them were, you saw these videos where they were going online saying that they regretted that, but this is the way that they voted. How much of that sentiment do you think had something to do with former Vice President Kamala Harris's ethnic background, in terms of maybe them not trusting her to vote because of that? To vote for her because of that. How much do you think that wove a part in it? Because we are seeing communities saying that we have to address some anti-Blackness within our community, because some of their leaders were saying, hey, that may have affected the way we voted, and maybe we didn't vote the right way.
Well, that's possible. There was also the fact that she was purportedly the quote unquote border czar. And so that And so that really saddled her with a legacy of some of the Biden administration's failures on immigration in a way that would not have been as acutely true, perhaps, for another candidate. But, racial and gender factors certainly, I think, can play into things in shaping the way that people vote. I hesitate to ascribe too much to it. And the reason I say that is that the polling was showing that Joe Biden, white guy, was also going to get clobbered by Donald Trump, right? Mm-hmm. That is, he was not doing well in the polling when he had to drop out of the race. So I think that the rejection of the Democratic Party in the 2024 election went beyond just race and gender factors.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, there's a broader concern there. But I will say what's going to be very interesting going forward is to see whether Republicans can hold on to those gains they made in minority communities. Whether minority communities turn against Republicans for economic reasons, right? If they see inflation start to tick up again, if they see that Trump is not delivering on his economic promises, or even whether they were just enthused about personal aspects of Donald Trump that won't translate to other Republican candidates, right? And that they may just stay at home during the midterm elections. I think, in fact, that the danger for Republicans in having shifted to a less educated, less wealthy, more economically downscale coalition is those voters are less likely to show up in midterm elections. And so I think Democrats go into 2026 with an advantage because, they have become the party of the educated and affluent to a significant degree. And those people show up and vote in midterm elections. And so, that's going to bear watching going forward.
And lastly, I want to end on something that Slotkin said during her rebuttal. She talked about the fact that although we are very divided as a country right now, we are still more united than divided. What are your thoughts on that?
I hope that that's true. I think we would all like that to be true. And we are united around certain things. I mean, we see a lot of polarization between far left and far right forces in this country. And those are the loudest voices. But most Americans are neither far left nor far right. Most Americans exist somewhere in the center, and they are not Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they're also not Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're somewhere in between that. And even though the loudest voices can be highly conflictual, I think there are things and values that continue to unite this country. The question is whether a viable political strategy can be predicated on appealing to those things that unite people. And as of right now, nobody has quite figured out how to do that.
It remains to be seen.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. And for those of you watching and or listening, if you like this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe.